Hey everyone, welcome to our now 16th Python tutorial, and today we're going to cover the ideas of variable scope and basically global versus local variables. So in the previous tutorial we did cover that briefly when we talked about our introduction into this whole section of Python functions, and I think we briefly talked about arguments and what exactly their role is in our functions. So once again, in Python, as well as many other programming languages such as Java and C++, which some of you may be familiar with, variables are available and operate within the region that they are created. And this concept is generally called variable scope. And there are two main scopes of variables in Python. We have our global variables, and then we have our local variables. So variables defined inside of a body function, variables defined inside of a function body have a local scope, and those defined outside have a global scope. So this means basically that local variables can be accessed only inside the function in which they're declared, whereas global variables can be accessed throughout the program body by all of the functions. And I got that information from the great people over at Tutorials Point. So to start out, I will simply create a quick example of what exactly variable scope is and how it can be seen and depicted in our Python programming. So let's go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so here you can see I've completed a quick example where it displays the different aspects and attributes of variable scope. So let's go ahead and break this down. So first, like we're going to see a lot throughout this whole section, we have a function, right, defined, and we call it local scope. And inside of our local scope, you see we are having an argument known as numLocal. So numLocal is defined as an argument, and therefore we automatically know that it is a local variable and it's basically confined to the space of this method, which ultimately ends as soon as this return statement is said, basically. So next we have numGlobal, which you can see is defined right here. So numGlobal, we understand, is a global variable. So right now we're using numGlobal, and here we are calling our local scope and supplying numGlobal as an argument. So then it passes up here, and numLocal is equal to the value of numGlobal. And now numGlobal within our local scope is equal to numLocal times 2. So I know it sounds really confusing because I said a lot of globals and locals and nums, but once we run the program, you guys will see exactly what's going on. But before I do that, I just want to break it down a little further. And you can see right here, we're just printing out numGlobal. So this line here is going to cause a lot of confusion, and so is this line right here. So I don't want any of that to happen, but it's kind of unavoidable because this is kind of a really weird topic to look at. So believe it or not, this line right here will print out numLocal times 2, which in this case will be 20. Whereas this line right here will print out 10. And the reason for that is, since we're passing our global variable here, it's only going to be worth 20 within the scope of our method. And once you refer to it outside, we can still access it. However, the value that it's no longer equal to the value that we've defined it to be within our method, if that makes sense. So I'll go ahead and run this one so you guys can get a deeper understanding of what exactly is going on right here. So you can see, once I've run the program, it is printing out 20 for our numGlobal inside here, 20 because it's returning 20, and right here it is printing out 10 because once again, inside our numGlobal has a different value as opposed to outside. And lastly, you can see I've commented out one statement, and that is our print numLocal, and that is just to show you defining or trying to access local variables outside of our method will not work. So if I go ahead and run this again, the first 3 prints work out, but you can see right here our compiler is not able to locate our numLocal as it's not defined outside of our method, and therefore variable scope kicks in and says this is going to be a big issue. So now that we got understanding of what exactly variable scope is, let's look into how exactly you can override the concepts of variable scope, and that really comes into play with our global keyword. So global keyword, I will simply create a program that explains how exactly global keyword works, and then we'll get into some, I guess, fun and a little bit tricky questions towards the end. So let's go ahead and get started with global keyword. Right, so here you can see we have a fairly small program, and we're using our defining, and we're calling our method new function. Doesn't take any arguments. However, we are defining a variable right here, but instead we're using our global keyword. So what exactly our global keyword does, I've stated right here, it's used to create a global variable within the local scope. So there's not many times where you'll see like a need for a variable within the local scope requiring that global keyword, because you really can just define it outside. But I believe you'll see some rare instances, and I just want to make sure you guys understand what exactly the global keyword does. So right here we have keyword, and we're saying kiwi, and we're saying kiwi is equal to 13, and below we're calling our new function in which we're defining this variable and setting it a value. And as you saw previously, when we try to access numLocal outside of its scope, it raised some issues, whereas right here it's working perfectly fine as it can access our variable kiwi. So that was just a quick breakdown of exactly what variable scope is all about. We talked about global versus local variables, as well as how we can override that using the global keyword, and I hope this gave you a fairly good example of what exactly variable scope is. And now that we've broken down all of that, it's time for us to get into a little bit of a challenge. And I thought that having you guys write out a couple challenge programs might not be the best case scenario with the variable scopes, and I instead decided that I would give you guys a little bit of a test just to check how well you guys are understanding this concept and really show you the odd scenarios that can take place. So for this first one, question 1, we should find the result. So we have a function strawberry. Fruit is equal to 99. We're defining a variable, a local variable, I might add, and it's returning fruit. And we're simply calling strawberry outside, and then we are saying print fruit. So based on this, I'm sure you guys already know what's going to happen. If I were to run this, it will show you exactly. It's going to throw an error as we're trying to access a local variable outside of its variable scope. So that was question 1. Now let's move on to question 2. In question 2, we have our variable yellow. It's a global variable, and we're setting it to 50. And next, we're defining a function banana. Doesn't take any arguments. However, we are changing the value of our global variable to 100 and returning it below. So now if I were to print yellow, I'll go ahead and give you guys a couple seconds to think on what that might return, and then I will run the program. So have at it. And feel free to obviously write down this code and test it in your own collab, or if you have downloaded Python, that you can work on that as well. So I'll give you a little bit of time. Okay, so I guess time's up. And what you can see right here is that it will print out 50 because, as I've mentioned before, the global variable's value within the method, within the scope of the method, is very different from what its value is outside. So once you run it, you can see it will return 50. So now on to question 3. This one looks kind of tiny, but it is mighty. So we'll just see what's occurring right here. You have red is equal to 9, and if true, red is equal to 16. So I know what you're thinking. This has nothing to do with what we've talked about with our functions, but I just want to show you guys a little bit of a confusing example, as we often work with if statements, and I just want to show you guys how they compare to the likes of functions and methods that we've defined. So go ahead and look at this program and guess exactly what you think is going to occur, and I'll run it so you guys can check if you were right. And yep, red should be equal to 16, as there's no rules for variable scope within an if statement. So lastly, let's go on to question 4, and this one I thought was probably the hardest question that I got out of the set. It's probably the one that's most confusing. You can see right here we're asking to find the result. We have our global variable blue, set it to 2. We're saying if false, blue is equal to 66, so we know that this is not going to run at all. We can basically discard that. But then you're looking at our definition, blueberry, and you're saying if true within our method, set cc is equal to 40. So that's just defining another method. Sorry, another variable, and this is obviously a variable of local scope since we've defined it within our method. So you can see right here, we're having blueberry, and then you print blueberry, and you can see that nothing is going to happen as it will return 2. And I don't think that was supposed to be CC. Sorry, I'm pretty sure that is supposed to be blue. So even if that were to be blue, you can see when I run it, it will still stay 2, as once again we are changing the value of a global variable inside of the local variable scope, so it's not going to affect what goes on outside. So I hope this gave you a really quick rundown of variable scope and global versus local variables. I will of course be linking my code into the description of the video below, so feel free to check that out. And as always, I hope you have a great day and be back for the next tutorial.